So I spent, I think, the first 10, 11 years of my life. My mum and dad were both converted in the Baptist church. And my dad was a dentist and my mother was a dental nurse. They met in the practice they were in, and then they both started attending a Baptist church together. And that's what I was raised in. These were very happy years for me because it was very kid-friendly, very child-friendly. Loved the Sunday school teachers, and yeah, very good atmosphere, very happy. But what I didn't know at the time was that some error had crept in, which, just to simplify things, meant that the Old Testament was being sort of ignored and pushed out and downplayed. As I say, I didn't know anything about what that meant at my age, and my dad didn't know an awful lot either, but knew that there was something wrong, and I think tried to get some things changed but without success. And at the time, he was a dentist, and one of his patients was a Presbyterian minister who persuaded my father to come over, and so he did. He took our whole family. There were 5 kids. I was the oldest with my twin brother, and it was a very painful transition for me and my brother, especially in our early teens, as it were. The atmosphere was completely different. It was a very dark church, even literally. All the seats were dark wood, dark walls. They even turned the lights off for the sermon, which I could never understand. The minister was still in the light, but it was a psalms-only church, no musical instruments, very, very conservative form of Presbyterianism, and sermons were very long, prayers were very long, Sunday school was very long. We had to memorize tons of verses, tons of catechisms, and I mean, that's all good, but it was a very, I got whiplash almost from the change, and I was going to a very rough public school as well, high school, and I think when you put these things together with an unregenerate heart, it was a bad recipe. And so my teen years from age 12 onwards really were very rebellious years. I was living you might say, a double life. At school I was something, and at home under my parents' roof I was something else. And got in with some really bad friends who weren't really friends at all, but that's what we call them. And over the years just started wandering further and further away spiritually, and the double life got more and more contrasted. I'm sure it was a great grief to my parents, because although I thought I was hiding from them, I know now that they were seeing things and they knew things that I didn't know about. And so there was a real party culture at this school, which I embraced, and very frustrated at parental constraints being put upon me at times. And hated school, just wanted to play soccer. Party and soccer was really everything to me. I wanted to make a lot of money. I thought soccer might be the ideal way to do that. Unfortunately, as you might see when I stand up soon, I'm very skinny. And I was even skinnier then. And so I really didn't have the build for it, although it was a real dream. So then I thought business would be the way to make a lot of money, so I started running a couple of little businesses while I was at school, and as a result I failed a number of my exams, did very poorly in school, left a year early, and just wanted to make money. I managed to get a job with an insurance company, a finance company that was very successful, and it was a very prosperous time in the 80s. When Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher were ruling in our respective countries, and it was very boom years, and it was easy to make a lot of money in that industry, which really fed my greed even more. And made me very self-centered, materialistic, living for the weekends, living for vacations, living for things. Eventually got enough income to buy my own place with a cheap company mortgage. And again, I thought that was freedom. This was the beginning of true life, to get away from my parents and live the life that I could without any restraint. And I remember when I left, the day I left home, I think I was probably about 19 or so, my mother wrote me a letter, which I believe I still have. And it was a plea from a mother's heart to a prodigal son. And she was pleading with me to remember Christ, to remember what I'd been taught, and that I would turn from my wicked ways and live. And I hated the letter because it was painful. It actually made me cry. I remember reading it in my car and crying, which maybe, again, I look back, I think maybe God was beginning to work. So I hated it, and yet it touched me. And I couldn't actually get rid of it in my mind and conscience, which again really frustrated me and annoyed me. And they knew the life I was living, but what could they do at that age? Very little, if anything. And so I continued on this course. At times I would be out with my friends on a Friday night, and I would be miserable. The things I thought would make me really happy made me really sad. And I even remember sitting outside some places in Glasgow on a Friday night, early morning, crying, weeping, miserable. My friends all inside having a great time, and me out here just miserable. I would walk home to my apartment. I'd lie there in bed and think, right, I've got to change. I have to stop this life. I knew it was wrong, and yet I still wanted it. I have to be honest. And that went on for a number of months, even a year or so. Resolutions that were soon broken. Guilty conscience. I was raised to, the Lord's Day was very strictly controlled. Like when I lived at home, I had to be home by midnight on a Saturday, even when I was 18, 19. And I remember one day my friend came to me and asked me to come out to the local pub on a Sunday night. And for the first time I said yes. And I remember sitting in that pub. A friend bought me a drink. And I was convinced I was a dead man. The conscience was just so powerfully smiting me. And I think I took one sip, and I said, I've got to get out of here. I was sure the place was going to collapse on me. Really, it was. And I went home, and I remember actually praying, God, I'm really sorry, I'll never do this again. I was not converted, but conscience was really accusing and condemning and frightening me. And I knew I was going to hell if I died. And I did not want to die in that place. So clearly, again, looking back, not understanding at the time, but looking back, God was pursuing, God was chasing, God was hounding me. And then a few things happened in my life that really brought my life to, I don't know if you call it a climax or a low max, but our company had a very big do on. It was a presentation of a new financial product. We got these TV personalities in to help us launch it. It was at a big hotel, Gleneagles, and the Scottish soccer team was actually staying there at the time. We were mixing with these top stars, and it was a kind of moment I'd lived for. This is it. This is like what life is all about. And feeling of self-importance and accomplishment. And I went home that night, came into the office the next day, expecting a real buzzing atmosphere, and everyone was really down. I found out that one of my bosses, top executive, had driven home, had hit the back of a car, driven by a young woman. Her baby in the back, 6 months old, was catapulted out and killed on the side of the highway. And eventually he went to prison for a very long time for manslaughter. And this is like one of the people we idolized, one of the people we wanted to be. And I remember thinking that, number one, that could have been me. And number two, he'd been drinking. He was totally out of control on the way down the road. And number two, this was where my life was heading. Self-destruction and destruction to others. A very selfish, couldn't care less about other kind of approach to life. And then my friend, my colleague who worked just opposite me, he was about 10 years older than me, he was in his early 30s, he died over a space of about 2 months of bowel cancer. And he was coming into the office still through that time, though he was trying different treatment. He was an ungodly man, but he was trying things like faith healing. He went to Lourdes and tried everything, but over that period he just shriveled and withered and died in front of my eyes. And went to his funeral, very upset afterwards. It was the first man I'd known who had died that I was at a funeral of. And again, God was sort of showing to me, David, this could be you. Are you ready? You know, this is, sooner or later, you're going to be in that man's position. And then a third thing that happened to me was I lost a big pension case that lost me a lot of money. And I would usually have been very upset about that because I was very money-oriented. And it didn't put me up or down. I couldn't care less. Well, that's life, you know. I'd lost my enthusiasm for my job. I was finding excuses not to go out with my friends. And I remember going home and talking to my father, who by then had become a pastor. He went into the ministry age 47. And he saw I was miserable. And they were trying to appeal to me from time to time. They didn't plague me. But when I came home, they always welcomed me and tried to make me feel at home. But now and again would, appeal to me with the gospel. And this was one opportunity my dad took. And he said, well, David, have you ever thought it might be the Lord who is working in your life and convicting you of sin and showing you your need? Is he converting you maybe? And I hadn't really thought about that up until that point. But when he said it, I knew that was what was happening. I couldn't deny it. It wasn't something I was doing. It was something that was being done to me. The sovereign grace of God was hunting me down and bringing me, drawing me to himself along a very painful road, a very necessarily painful road. And my mother gave me a Bible study book. I hadn't been reading my Bible for years, hadn't prayed really for years, just when I was in trouble. And it was a Bible study on Joshua, which wasn't particularly helpful, but it got me into my Bible again. Started reading the Gospels, and over a period of months, it was like Jesus Christ just came out of the pages of Scripture, like as a real person, not as like a past historical figure, but as a very vivid, almost tangible presence in my life. And started talking with him. I felt he was talking with me through the Bible, not voices in my head, but through the Bible. It just felt very personal, very just addressed directly to my needs, and felt deep love, gratitude, began to understand the gospel. I had been I was still going to church fairly regularly. My own church that I was raised in, I'm sad to say, there wasn't real gospel preaching in it. It was very hard to understand the minister. A lot of people left the church through the years. And I felt I'd never really understood the gospel. I was reading these books, the Bible, and beginning to get it. But it was when my friend who came alongside me, a Christian friend who saw the Lord was at work, he started giving me tapes of American Baptists, Al Martin, Walt Chantry, and some others as well. And the preaching was just so powerful. It was unlike anything I'd heard before in my life. And I just began to understand what God was doing in applying his salvation to my life. And made me want to become part of his church. And I was actually baptized as an adult because, of course, I'd been raised in the Baptist church. I hadn't been baptized as an infant. I probably wasn't baptized with as much water as you would like, but it was still an adult baptism by profession of faith. So I think that always gives me a wee bit of credibility with Baptists. But that was a very moving time. I felt very warmly embraced by the people in my church, and time of great humbling, growing, and really just rejoicing in God's mercy and grace to a completely undeserving sinner. And a lot of regret over years, a wasted decade of my life. And a decade that did me much damage, and I harmed others as well, and it's grievous and painful to think back on. What a horribly destructive and ugly life a life of sin is. And just as I said to the young people, don't follow me. Please don't waste your life, not a year, not a month, in that kind of lifestyle, because it never, although you're forgiven, it sort of never leaves you either. If you kindle sin in your life, yes, the Lord in his mercy saves you and covers you, forgives you, but that power is still there, and it's a battle, thankfully with the help of the Holy Spirit and the gospel, that you can win. But man, it's sometimes a massive struggle, a life or death battle, to fight against sins that were fed and kindled through these years. So not worth it at all, the scars and the memories. But God is merciful, God is gracious, God is sovereign. Anyone who's in that life, I just want to encourage you, he is more than mighty to save to the uttermost, and redeem your life, give you a chance to live again, wipe the slate clean, begin afresh, and it's such a better life than any. I mean, I felt I had a sort of crash course in worldliness that ended in utter misery and futility. But it makes you so much value grace and the gospel in Jesus Christ.
Praise God. It was, I won't spend any more of your time, but Al Martin was really the beginning of the Lord working in my life through that summer when I was right before high school. And so it was just interesting. I mean, from Scotland, the technology, being able to give the cassette tapes, which isn't technology today, but it was encouraging. So then the Lord then began to call you into the ministry. You pastored there in Scotland for 10 years. And then, I don't know the rest of this story, but you've said that it's an interesting story how he got you from Scotland then to Grand Rapids, Michigan. How was it that you moved from Scotland to Grand Rapids?
Yeah.
Because your wife is also from Scotland, right?
So she is. When I was living a worldly life, my twin brother, Kenny, was witnessing to me frequently. And he would really be jabbing me about who I was, what I was doing. I remember one time saying to him, and this was again a couple of years before I was converted, Kenny, if the Lord ever saves me, I'll be all out for him. It will be all or nothing. And these words came back to me not long after I was converted, and the Lord was saying, well, David, is it all or nothing? And so I thought, okay. I wanted to serve him. I wanted to witness. I was very zealous and doing open air preaching. I mean, I was totally confused in some ways, but anyway, I thought, hey, if I could maybe go abroad, Youth with a Mission, Operation Mobilization, go on one of these. I was very interested in that Logos, Doulos, the boat that went around the world, with young people, young Christians to evangelize. And my motives for wanting that were definitely mixed. You know, it's kind of a glamour thing to it as well. But my dad put me in touch with this pastor who discouraged that and said, David, you should really go and get some training. You know, you should really know a bit more before you start going out and trying to teach others. I didn't like to hear that, but it was good advice. I hadn't gone to college or university. I went straight into business after school, and I realized this was a long road ahead. I had to go and get a degree, bachelor's degree, and then go to seminary. That was a 6-year total. I applied, and I couldn't get in. I was too late. And so I went to Hungary, Eastern Europe, for a year. There was an opportunity in my church to just go out there and help some poor churches, poor pastors build their schools, their churches, their missions, help Romanian refugees who were coming over from the persecution in their country. It was the late 80s. The Iron Curtain was still up, coming down wonderfully, but still up. And that was a wonderful year for me. It was a year of a lot of learning, watching real Christians, Christians who had suffered a lot under communism. And I began to see what true gospel ministry was all about, and it really, I thought, it gripped me, this calling. And I think God used certain men, ministers there, to really shape my idea of what a minister of the gospel really was, and draw me to it, and give me a real deep sense of calling to it. And it was a time of purifying and learning as well. Then I came home, went to Glasgow University, and had a friend who was feeding me just great books from Banner of Truth and great tapes, again, mainly from America. And that was where I met my wife. She was training to be a medical doctor. And she'd been in my church for, I don't know how long, probably 4 years, and had hardly set eyes on her. It wasn't a big church. It was just she was a Christian. I wasn't. I couldn't really abide Christians, and I'm sure she probably thought I was a complete idiot.
She's never said that, though.
Well, when I came back from Hungary, I bumped into her, literally, on the street on the way to our prayer meeting. And she tells me now she was completely stunned at the change. She thought it was a different guy. And I was stunned because I thought, hey, she's actually quite interesting and even attractive. It was a spiritual attraction, you know, more than anything, a spiritual kinship. And just so happened my bus stopped just beside her apartment, and we would often bump into one another on the way to the prayer meeting and young people's meetings. And we began to talk, and just an amazing spiritual kinship and togetherness, and just young ones here. That's the basis of the best relationship. Spiritual oneness, spiritual attraction, spiritual fellowship. That's just, you build on that, not on physical attraction so much. That can come, and it will come. But you get that right, it's like such a solid foundation. And the Lord just drew us to one another over a number of months, very unexpectedly. My mother used to try and match me up with various girls in my church. And I always remember saying, I will never marry a minister's daughter. And then she would point to this nurse or something. I'll never marry anyone in the medical profession. And I married a minister's daughter who's a doctor. So never say never. And she's been the greatest blessing to my life. She's just been such a stable, sensible, sober, spiritual influence upon me. And of course, coming from a pastor's home, had a ton of experience to share with me as I was being shaped as a pastor. And after seminary, we were called to a small church in the Highlands of Scotland, out in the middle of nowhere. And I was a city boy. It was a strange mix. But it was very good. It was a good learning time. I loved the people. It was just about 30 or 40 people in the church. And we had our first children there. It's a great memory. And unfortunately, our whole church, there was about 100 churches in our federation, had a terrible 10-year controversy. I came in a bit towards the end of it over a professor in our church of theology who was teaching error and who also was being accused of immorality. And our church wasn't dealing with it. And he was a very well-known man. There was a lot of shielding of him and protecting of him. People thought if he goes down, the church goes down, and it was terrible. But if you don't stand for truth and justice and morality, you're not a church anymore. And so a number of us, some of us who knew some of the young women who were involved that were assaulted, we said, look, this has to come to trial in a church court, or else we might as well pack up shop and go home. And they refused to do it. They wouldn't even hear them. And eventually we said, well, we're not giving up. We're protesting this. We're fighting for this. And eventually we were disciplined and put out of the church, me and 20-odd other ministers, many elders, numbers, hundreds of church members. It was a very painful time. Cut a long story short, I ended up losing my congregation over it because they wanted to stay with the main church. But I just knew you have to stand for what's right. You have to do what's right. Leave the consequences with God. He will look after us. So after 5 years we left that. We had to leave the church. And thereafter were about 10 months of no ministry for me. I thought I would get a call straight away in the new church that we started. And there were vacant churches. I wasn't getting a call, and it was very humbling. I thought, I've stood up for the Lord, and yet, where, Lord, are you now? And it was needed. I needed to be humbled again. And the Lord was preparing me, and then I got a call to a church. It was the biggest church in our denomination, several hundred people. And again, 7 very happy years there. Wonderful years, great elders, great people. Started teaching a little our own seminary students. And then I received a call from Puritan Reformed Seminary in Grand Rapids, where Joel Beakey teaches, to come and be a professor there. We'd had some contact over the years. And I did not want to go because I was very happy where I was. I didn't want another time of destabilizing of my wife and family. My wife had passed through a very difficult time after the church split. And our third child, she had postpartum depression. That went on for a long time. We didn't really understand it. I didn't understand it. I'd always been taught that if a Christian's depressed, they're either not a Christian or they've got terrible sin in their life. And this didn't work for my wife because I knew she was a Christian and I knew she was far more godly than I was. And then she was also a very type A, very happy extrovert person. It wasn't personality. And yet here she was in a desperate, dark hole. And the Lord taught us much through it. We eventually, both of us, learned a lot. I mean, she was a doctor who dealt a lot with depression, but couldn't recognize it in herself. She too thought it was spiritual, that she'd done something terribly wrong, and God was punishing her. And eventually we came to see that there were many factors involved, not least of which was the time of dreadfully stressful times in the church split. One of her sister's marriages broke up. Her best friend left her marriage. Being a doctor, being a pastor's wife, homeschooling, children in quick succession. It was a terrible recipe, really, for eventually wearing someone down physically and mentally and emotionally. And that had spiritual consequences. Not a spiritual cause, but spiritual consequences. So with the help of counsel, medication, exercise, rest, just building a lot of things into our lives, we, over a number of years, came to really understand this more, and it opened up many opportunities of ministry, not least of which was to come and teach counseling as well as Old Testament in this seminary. So I was reluctant to bring my wife over. I didn't want to destabilize her again. But again, I just kept sensing the Lord's call. I couldn't let go of it, and it was very hard. I didn't tell anyone in the church, didn't tell my parents, because I felt it's not going to happen, so why share it? But over 7-8 months, this kept coming back. David, this is God's call. And eventually, I heard one of my friends got a call to Australia to minister there. So I went to speak to him without sharing with him anything of my own quandary. And I said, how did you come to that decision? Because my principle of guidance that my father had taught me was stay where you are unless God shows you clearly otherwise. And then this friend of mine said, David, my principle is multiply influence. I said, okay, where do you get that in the Bible? He said, parable of the talents. I can stay here in Scotland and influence many, and that's good. But if I go there, this area of Australia has hardly any gospel churches, and there's tremendous opportunity. And he showed me the parable of talents. So I went home, I read the parable of the talents. I came to the one talent man who'd been given this opportunity to multiply and played safe. He said, I'll just keep this. I won't take any risks. I won't risk any instability. And then his master comes back and he gives it to him. And he says, look, what you gave me, I've given back to you. Just the status quo. And remember in the parable, the master says, take what you have and give it to the man with 10 talents. And he's cast out and punished. And as soon as I read it, I thought, I'm the one talent man. That God is giving this opportunity to go and train other pastors from all over the world to go out and to train others and teach others. And I'm playing safe. I'm saying I don't want to rock the boat. I want to keep stability. I love this church, these elders, this place, near my wife's family. Everything was just perfect. And yet, I believe that parable was saying to me, if you play safe, you think, oh no, I'll just keep this nice and tight and packaged and neat. I'll take that away from you and give it to someone else. And I knew there and then this was God's call. And I went in to see Shona. We talked about it through the months. And she'd always said, David, you've got to follow God's call, but you need to seek his will. And she would challenge me regarding motives and aims, and she was very good. So I went in to see her. I said, Shona, I believe God's calling us to Grand Rapids, Michigan. And she said, well, David, I will go wherever God calls you, but you better get it right. So it was an act of faith as well. If this is God's call, he will look after my wife. He will care for her, and he has done amazingly. She's never been better. Her mental, emotional health has been amazingly steady since we've come to Grand Rapids. Due to many factors, much more support in the church, much more support for homeschooling. The weather's much better. I mean, in Scotland, you just get cold rain in the winter and warm rain in the summer. Whereas in Grand Rapids, you get some really lovely summers, and even the winters, you can get out and do things in the snow and ski, and it's just been amazingly good. The Lord has more than answered our prayers. And
there was a cost to her as well, though, and she can't practice medicine here, or
That's
didn't
right,
transfer over?
Yeah. No, she can't practice here. She would have to go through virtually the whole course again, and all the exams and all the cost. And again, we felt we need to care for her and not overstretch and overstress. It wasn't going to be worth it. And she's got more than enough work in her hands with 5 children. And she hasn't missed it. Well, that's not quite true. She has missed it, but she sees again as God's call is to mothering and parenting and being a wife. And she has many opportunities to serve in different ways. And here's the strange thing, just to close the loop here. Who is in our congregation today but Al Martin? Believe it or not. This man who was like my spiritual mentor from afar for many years, helping me understand the gospel. Then in ministry, I went through his whole pastoral theology lectures. And then came to Grand Rapids not long after he moved there in his second marriage, after his wife had died. He started coming to the seminary to teach and to take chapels, and I just couldn't believe him sitting beside Al Martin. And then, for various reasons, he turns up in my congregation. He now lives just round the corner from us, and it's just a wonder to me, the way God's providence works, to actually know this man who'd been such an influence in my life, and continue to learn from him to this day.
Praise God. What has been the biggest challenges or transition going from Scotland to Michigan? It sounds like the Lord's given you peace. It's been a good transition. Have there been things you've noticed, differences in the church from Scotland to the United States?
Yeah. Maybe, first of all, the biggest loss is parents. You know, both my parents are now in their late 70s, Shona's in their late 80s. You miss them massively. You know, and they miss us, and they miss the grandchildren. They've been amazingly supportive. They didn't try and keep us there. Both of them said, all of them said, you've got to do God's will. You've got to follow His call. But you miss them.
And you have health difficulties that don't allow you to travel back and forth. I don't want to dump two questions on you at once, but I'll let you.
Let me come back to that in just a second. So, differences in the churches. Number one, your churches have far more people in them. Far more. You've no idea how low the cause of Christ is in Scotland. The churches are very small, very aged. That's not a knock on old people, but we need young people, and mainly because of the secular society, very hostile public schools. A lot of our young people just leave mid-teens, late teens, and our churches are in a desperate state, and Scotland's in a dreadful state. And you don't know. I mean, I know America's sliding. I'm not looking at it through rose-tinted spectacles, but you've no idea how privileged you are, and how blessed you are. And yeah, there's worrying signs. You're following the same trends, but even to this day, you're in a far healthier position than the Scottish churches are. Even politically, I know it's such a mixed-up situation at the moment, but you know, you do win some battles now and again. We haven't won a battle in Scotland for decades. It's just all going in one direction. There's a lot of shallowness, I know, as well, but still, it's better than hostility and enmity. Regarding my own health, about 2011, my life of ministry was way too busy, and I had some warning signs in my health and other providences, and I just ignored them, I have to be honest, and kept going. And eventually, God stopped me. I got a DVT, a deep vein thrombosis, in my leg. I didn't recognize it at the time. And then a few days later, it broke off, and I had pulmonary emboli in my lungs, which is blood clots. Some people, I think maybe 15-20% of people just drop dead on the spot. Thankfully, got to hospital with my wife's prodding. And they told me what had happened. Went on blood thinners for a while. It slowed me down for a time. Not for long enough. And eventually, a few years later, the same thing happened to me again. And that was when I really had to pause and recalibrate and learn deep lessons. And it's been really good. But it does mean my travel is very restricted. If I do go to Europe, which is very rare now, I have to take a lot of extra precautions in addition to the medication I take. But on the whole, it's been a really good thing, because there's a verse in the Bible that came to me very powerfully in the second season of that illness, which was, "Be still and know that I am God." And if there's anything that I needed, and I think which American Christian culture needs, it's to slow down and be still and be silent. Because without it, you cannot know God deeply, intimately, personally. So there are losses, but there's usually above all, there's a net gain in all these problems as you come through them. Not at the time, but God eventually shows you his purpose and his kindness and his mercy, even in illnesses and diseases and trouble.
And that, a lot of that was really your point with the retreat even, was if we so bombard ourselves with all this digital technology, we don't ever be still and know that he is God, we're not going to have the depth of the relationship or the relationship with God we need. I would encourage you, we've gone pretty well to our end of our time, but please talk to your children about what they've learned, help them in that. Any quick advice to the parents whose teenagers have just heard that you would want to give on how they should deal with that?
Yeah, I think number one, education. You need to educate yourselves. There are great books out there to explain the depth and width and length of this problem. Don't put your head in the sand and ignore it and think it doesn't affect you, it's not affecting your children. It is. The Tech-Wise Family by Andy Crouch is a really neat little book, very helpful. Many even secular books that you can find that will really warn you and educate you about the dangers of digital technology and how to get it under control. So education of yourself. Communication is the second thing. You have to be in conversation with your children about this and create regular times of discussing this with them. It's not to cut it entirely out of their lives. That's impossible. They'll just go out behind your back. But to try and help them see even, not just the moral side of things, but even just self-interest, the damage this is doing to their brains, their emotions, and so on. So regular communication. Just set aside a time every month or so to have an hour and just lace it into conversations. This is a constant issue to be talked about. And the third thing is try and do it in a non-judgmental way. If you come at this in a punish mode, you're not going to get communication. You're not going to get openness and honesty. Your kids are going to fall, and they're going to fail in this. Maybe not everyone, but 99%. And so create an atmosphere of grace, forgiveness, and openness, and acceptance where they can come and say, yeah, okay, I need help here. I've stumbled, I'm fallen, I'm struggling. I need advice, I need help, I need accountability, so that they can come and be honest and open and truthful and know that you're not going to come down on them like a ton of bricks, and that tends to drive away. There may be sanctions, right? But that's not the overall atmosphere of these conversations. To try and create trust, transparency, openness, authenticity, and talk to them about your own struggles too, because we're all in this together, and you have to be vulnerable, transparent with them as well, and try and set a model, try and be an example for them that will inspire them and encourage them too.
Almost what I'm hearing is you have to keep somewhat of the communication time and the discipline time a little separate. And if we as our parents, if all we do is discipline our children about media, we're not doing our job.
Right.
We've got to have the communication
Yep.
as well. Yeah. I would encourage you, once they're online, parents, at least go listen to session number 2. 1 and 2, start there, and you'll probably want to listen to 3 and 4 anyway. But at least maybe you'll hear, even if you're not a parent, go listen to session 2, and it'll show you where we are as a society. But don't miss out on the others. But I think it would be helpful for seeing the seriousness of it. So, well, let us close in prayer. Greg Boutwell, would you dismiss us in prayer?
Father, we thank you for this opportunity to contemplate these issues which are before each one of us today, for the grace, for the insight, the wisdom that the speaker has brought during this recent youth retreat. And this has been prayed before. We pray that there would be spiritual fruit to garner during this time. God's word would have penetrated the hearts of those who need so desperately to be convicted of their sin. But those of us who are a little bit older, there's a message in here for us as well. We pray that you would bless these words that our speakers give to us this morning. Again, as we look to his faithfulness, his testimony as being a testimony to your grace and your love. When we leave this place, Father, may we be morally instructed, not only in the scriptures, but in the wisdom about how we are to comport ourselves within society, within our own homes. We thank you for the ministry of Dr. Murray and this recent youth retreat. We pray for spiritual fruit to come in the days ahead. We pray for all these things